While we see depictions of human rights violations in the Congo, Rwanda, and even Iran, few Americans know that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch has found the U.S. guilty of human rights violations as well. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Rochelle Turman joins me in discussing how human rights is part of the global naming and shaming to effectively enforce human rights in every nation around the world. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Rochelle Turman, who's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in political science. We're going to discuss human rights and the international response to that. Welcome, Dr. Turman.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you could join us. We'd like to talk about the research that you've done and the book that you're currently working on that's called Backlash: Defiance, Human Rights, and the Politics of Shame. Human rights is an issue that appears often in the nightly news and in the newspapers and becomes a concern, particularly when we talk about a world in conflict. We can probably think back to the Clinton administration where famously Madeleine Albright said 500,000 kids starving to death from the sanctions was worth it, but that didn't become a human rights violation. Or currently with the Saudi bombing of Yemen, and the United Nations says it's the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, but as far as I know, that hasn't become a human rights violation. So I guess the first question is, what is the global, the transnational template or process for making human rights an issue, either as a charge or as a claim?
Well, since 1945, a robust set of institutions and processes around human rights have developed in the international sphere. So we can think, for example, about the United Nations and the Human Rights Council. We can think about various international organizations. But I think a lot of attention has been placed on non-state actors, especially human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, working in concert with other actors like governments, like the United Nations, like experts or international organizations, to put moral pressure on a state that violates human rights. So this could take a variety of different forms, what I call shaming.
This would be a violation of human rights, not necessarily according to UN statutes, but according to Amnesty International's conclusion, or the government that they've collaborating with their claim.
I mean, human rights is kind of an interesting set of laws and treaties and norms, because since it is international and the international system is anarchic, there's no unified government.
Authority, yes.
Right. So it's a special kind of rule that has to be enforced, not by a centralized authority, like in the domestic sphere. If you break a law, there might be a central authority that follows certain procedures. But with international human rights, the onus is really on other actors, especially states, since they have the most power in the international system, to decide what constitutes a violation.
Does this then become like diplomatic pressure? So if a state, say the Congo, is charged with human rights, it becomes, I guess some states could issue sanctions like the U.S. did against Iraq or is currently doing against Venezuela, but that's acting independently of any authorized body?
Right, so exactly. So different actors have their own processes by which they name and identify and condemn human rights violations. So individual states might use diplomatic pressure. They might use, which is the most common, They might use something with a little bit more teeth, like economic sanctions. Yes. Human rights organizations, it's very common. If you've ever been asked to sign a petition on behalf of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, on behalf of a political prisoner in China, for example, the United Nations might have a little bit more embedded systems, like, for instance, to issue a resolution condemning state violence in Syria. But I think the important point is that all of these actors, even though they have their own kind of internal processes and dynamics, there is no one centralized authority. The onus is really on other actors to condemn human rights violations. And you can imagine that for those actors, that's a very political decision.
Mm-hmm. And for the general public, whether we're citizens of this country or another country, it largely becomes, I would think, a media process.
Exactly.
And how well it's presented or reinforced or framed in such a way that will put an onus of, you say, shame on this naming and shaming the particular government or nation that is accused of human rights violations.
Exactly. If Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or any kind of non-governmental organization wants to kind of shine the international spotlight on a particular country or a particular violation, their main strategy at this point is to use media to advertise, if you will, or to market that violation.
To influence public opinion in the hopes that that opinion will move that particular government to take some actions, whether it's diplomatic or something else.
Exactly.
Or at least support whatever the government's
So they
already been doing.
they might put pressure on the violating government directly, or something that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch do a lot is they try to mobilize public opinion to put pressure on their governments, for instance, governments in the West, so those states could then issue their own pressure on a violating state.
You in your research and your presentation, you're talking about naming and shaming and then the ability to defy the naming and shaming on the international level. And I want to talk about that, but one thing just occurred to me. How does the International Criminal Court get its cases? Is that something that has to do with human rights, or is that another whole venue?
Yeah, so there are these international courts, the European Court of Human Rights, the International Criminal Court, that have their own kind of processes by which they pick up cases. And I think scholars are kind of split on the efficacy of those kinds of institutions, but I think everyone would agree.
They may have a charge in the criminal court, for instance, but it doesn't mean it can't necessarily be acted on.
Enforced, yeah. And I think everyone would agree that even the process by which a case comes to the International Criminal Court, as well as the sentence or the decision of that court, and then how it's enforced, all of those processes are deeply political.
I knew because Spain, I think, at one point charged Pinochet with crimes against humanity, and I don't think he ever ended up in Spain, but there was a trial and there was a determination of his guilt or not. But there's no enforcement for it. So it comes back to what you're primarily looking at, is how does this process of naming the violator of human rights and then hopefully shaming them into doing what is considered the right thing by those that are naming, I guess. So,
right.
And how does that process work? Because you've talked about a couple groups, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I think of another nonprofit group like Boycott, Divest, and Sanction against Israel, and they were making charges of human rights violations, which seems to me to raise some of the issues that you're talking about. The very fact that they made that charge has been discounted, and I know some state legislatures in the country have said that it's against the law to do boycott, divest, and sanctions against Israel. So the charges have been made, but the charges have never been investigated or followed up. The very fact that it's done is, I guess in your terms, where there's a defiance by Israel and the United States. So how does that process work? It would seem like once a nation from whatever quarter has said you're doing something unacceptable against parts of humanity, how can a nation kind of brush it aside, or what's that process?
Well, for a long time, the consensus in many parts of international relations has been that shaming really is one of the best tools that we have at our disposal to combat human rights violations. So the idea is that human rights organizations, along with states, the United Nations, experts, members of the international community, would exert moral pressure on a violating state, and by doing that, stigmatize and isolate that country and that regime from the international community, undermine its legitimacy, and thus pressure its leaders to comply with human rights norms in order to maintain good standing in the international community. Another important mechanism is that international shaming or condemnation could mobilize domestic opposition in the target state.
Okay.
So it could facilitate social and political mobilization that could put pressure on decision makers kind of from below.
Except that would seem it could be dangerous, because if you're saying a
Right.
state like Egypt with General Sisi that claims to be the elected president, and you say that they violated human rights for jailing 400 journalists on an afternoon, the response is not favorable to the people in Egypt that are inspired by Human Rights Watch, because the repression and the killing
Right.
and the imprisonment
Right.
just increases.
So yeah, so that could be certainly one way that shaming could backfire is if you advertise that, hey, Egypt is imprisoning a bunch of journalists and activists, then the folks on the ground might think, okay, it's not such a good idea for me to be a journalist or an activist. But I kind of focus on something a little different. I think that shaming can be counterproductive because it sparks a kind of a nationalist reaction in the country being shamed. So people typically resent being told what to do. They resent it even more when it comes from foreigners, and they respond very defensively. So if there is this kind of defensive reaction among the public in the country being shamed, leaders are then rewarded in some sense for standing up to international pressure against what is perceived as foreign domination. And those who give in and comply with foreign demands have their political legitimacy undermined at home. So when that happens...
Not necessarily always, though.
Of course,
Right?
yeah.
I mean, depending upon the actual relation, if it could give encouragement to those that want the extension of human rights or civil rights in a country, if their leaders have somehow, through sanctions or other lack of trade or lack of military aid or even financial aid for investments, has been reduced.
Well, I think that one thing, of course, shaming is going to have people are going to respond differently based on a host of factors. But one thing that I find pretty interesting is that, at least in some of the work that I've done, I found that people respond defensively to international shaming, even if they're sympathetic to the message. So I've conducted some survey experiments on a representative sample of Americans. The United States is actually one of the most shamed countries by Amnesty International, so it's kind of an interesting case.
We don't, I would argue that we don't know that, though. Amnesty International charging the U.S. with violating the human rights of Native Americans doesn't appear on the front page of the New York Times. So it may be true that Amnesty does it, but the U.S. media doesn't promote that.
Right, and I wouldn't say that most Americans probably know that Amnesty
they don't,
International
right.
continues to shame the United States. But regardless...
Not much of a shaming if nobody knows it, right?
Right. Well, it just so happens that when you do tell people that Amnesty International or an Amnesty International-like group is shaming the United States, they don't tend to take it well. They become more nationalistic. They become more hostile to international institutions and advocacy groups, and they have a more positive perception of human rights at home. And that's even, for Democrats and liberals and folks who are kind of theoretically sensitive or amenable to the message that Amnesty is promoting. The point is that just the nature of being shamed might shift public opinion in a counterproductive way.
I wonder if that's a universal or if it's a case by case, because if I'm in a country X and there's human rights violations and trade unionists are being disappeared, and to have the international community say that the government has exceeded its authority is repressive doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to forget all about everything the government's done to me and my neighbors and revert to some nationalist defense of this government. I can't imagine that that's a universal response. It may be more of a response. It may have more to say about the validity of the claim as opposed to making the claim itself. Is there a distinction there?
Of course. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that when you shame everyone on earth, they're universally going to become more nationalistic.
Yes.
The point is that we're trying to look at change, not absolute content of people's opinions. So what is the shift, the overall general shift in direction of public opinion? And it could be that what's happening is that those who ex ante were opposed to human rights then become emboldened by external shaming. They become defiant. While at the same time, those that are sympathetic to human rights, they don't necessarily switch sides, but they might inhibit their activism or kind of stay more quiet. So if that happens, no one's actually really shifting direction in that mechanism, right? But it still produces a shift in public opinion that could change the domestic political environment in the target state in ways that favor non-compliance.
I'm not trying to disagree with your overall claim about naming and shaming and the possible responses or the backlash, but it seems part of it will have to do with the legitimacy of the original claim.
Yeah, so I like to think about shaming like you would think about medicine. The question, does medicine help or hurt, is kind of an unintelligible question because there are conditions about having to do with the patient, having to do with the type of medicine, having to do with the disease.
Well, that's where I'm going. I want to have a discussion before we talk about what's the medicine or what's the shaming. Is there a reason to even prescribe medicine? So there has to be a determination that the person is sick or there's human rights violation. And lacking an international body or any criteria that is clear, it seems to become very political and very a part of the geopolitical position of any particular country, whether that's the US or the UK or France.
When we think about medicine, we have to actually look at the context and understand what medicine, what disease, and what patient. And so I like to apply that to shaming in order to think what is the relational context and the political context in which shaming is occurring, and that's going to tell us what it's probable, or we can't always predict with absolute accuracy, but that's what's at least going to give us hints about how it's going to land. So you made a good point, which is that shaming is very often used as a political weapon. So states especially, but also human rights organizations can choose to condemn human rights violations. For example, in Iran, not necessarily or not only because they want to see human rights improve in Iran, but also because they want to stigmatize the Islamic regime and that they think can give some kind of political advantage or advance their political aims. So when that happens, shaming tends to take a particular flavor or form. It tends to be very stigmatizing. It tends to lack credibility. It tends to be sensationalist. Kind of going back to your point, the content of the accusations probably will lack evidence that compared to a case in which we are shaming a geopolitical ally, for example. And so because there is that political motivation to stigmatize the Iranian regime, the actual content of the shaming is going to look a particular way, and it's going to look in a way precisely that is going to fuel or exacerbate a kind of defensive and defiant reaction in the target. And from our perspective, or at least from the perspective of the shamer, if I want to stigmatize Iran because I want to show that it's a barbaric regime and regime change is necessary, the fact that my shaming doesn't actually produce compliance does not inhibit me whatsoever from continuing to shame them, because if Iran continues to be defiant, that's just going to provide more evidence for my main political claim, which is that they're a rogue regime. And so I think sometimes you see these situations where both the shamer and the target are using human rights violations or those accusations as a political weapon, and no party actually cares about the substance of human rights violations.
I appreciated how you talked about what the conditions for defiance might be if there isn't a working relation between the two countries. The country that's being shamed is less likely to respond positively if the shamer lacks credibility, and I would assume credibility with the nation that's being shamed, not internationally, and if the shame is directed at the government rather than the practices. So like you're saying, in Iran, it's less about the practices and more about the evil government that needs to be replaced. I wonder if there's a fourth thing that has to do with political power, because it would seem like if the U.S. is going to shame, their ability to shame is infinitely much larger than the ability of, I don't know, Lebanon to shame Saudi Arabia, for instance.
Well, both countries can try to shame, but you're right that, and this is where I think relationships or geopolitical relationships become really important. We don't, as in the United States, are very hesitant to shame Saudi Arabia because they are a geopolitical ally, and we don't want to piss them off and experience the blowback that's going to kind of ensue. So we kind of hesitate to shame Saudi Arabia, but if we did decide to shame Saudi Arabia, for instance, if like during the Khashoggi case, if there's enough groundswell in the United States that pressures our government to actually shame fairly, because of the geopolitical relationship, that is going to have more of an effect on Saudi Arabia precisely because we have these geopolitical ties. So that's how shaming works, whether it's between countries or whether it's between individuals. You persuade the target to voluntarily change his or her behavior in order to maintain a valued political relationship. If there's no relationship to maintain, if there's no valuable partnership that both parties want to sustain for their own mutual benefit, then shaming will fail. And when it comes from an adversary or a rival in which there is like an antagonistic relationship, shaming is probably going to do more than fail. It's going to be counterproductive.
Well, the interesting thing after you went through that scenario, it kind of raises the question at what point do human rights charges even have merit? Because what you just described was the effect of U.S. Charges of human rights would have on Saudi Arabia, and the fact that the U.S. does not move in that direction suggests that human rights violations aren't of particular importance to the United States. And the reason is, well, they're our allies, but in other cases it becomes a top priority. Again, it becomes a means to extend influence or persuade a particular public that this is something worthy of attention. But
I mean, the United States, when it's trying to decide whether to shame Saudi Arabia, of course it has to consider that geopolitical relationship, but it also has other considerations. So, for instance, its domestic public. If there was, hypothetically...
well, they cut off 87 people's heads every year. So, I mean, when we talk about capital punishment, and we talk about it's like 30,000 people have been killed in Yemen, and the U.S. is supplying.
Yeah, so but if the United States just what I'm saying, I agree. The United States, as a matter of public foreign policy, it's not at the top of their agenda, nor is it in their interest to criticize Saudi Arabia. What I'm saying is that if the American public or if other countries pressure the American government because they think it's outrageous that Saudi Arabia is doing these things, that could move the needle a little bit. And I think that's what Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, or perhaps that strategy that they're pursuing.
That makes complete sense, and it strikes me again. There's this relationship between the shamer and their political power, and also their media power to do that. Because I would suspect if the American public, separate from the American government, knew the actual conditions and the relations, there would be much more of a position in favor of human rights in country A, B, or C. But absent a report or access to that report, we don't know. So we're kind of subject to waiting for the next human rights report against this country any particular country, which puts us at a real disadvantage.
Yeah.
So I think I look forward to your book, and maybe we can have you back to talk about it, because I'd certainly like to talk about some specific events, but the time kind of ran away from us.
All right.
And I know that's not right. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Dr. Turman, for joining me today
Thank
on
you.
the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.